Hey everyone, it's been a while since I've dunked on those idiot frauds at Discovery Institute, but I think it's time to circle back and revive this playlist. And we're going to get things moving again with the pointless dork who kicked it off in the first place, Casey Luskin. Let's get started. If you'll recall, in part 1 of this series, we took a big dump on a shameful bit of propaganda that lied repeatedly about the entire field of anthropology and slandered some prominent researchers in the process. We exposed the deceptive editing of a Nova documentary to make it seem like Owen Lovejoy was nefariously manipulating evidence, and we got some commentary from him regarding this deplorable behavior. We looked at how they lie about primary scientific literature, zooming in on a tiny fragment of a paper to imply that it says the precise opposite of what it actually says. And we got commentary from the author of that paper condemning this deception as well. In general, we very nicely outlined the disgusting tactics that would define this entire series, by pointing out how every last member of the DI is merely a fraud masquerading as a scientist, while lying through their teeth about real science, all to push the insidiously regressive agenda of their wealthy Christian nationalist donors. And boy has it worked. They have gained precisely zero ground in their quest for influence and relevance, partially due to their own profound incompetence, but also largely due to content like mine and that of other science communicators who consistently expose their shady tactics for all to see. And for those who complain that I mischaracterized their motives, why would the DI be funding Project 2025? Don't look for this now, they've had their name removed since it exposes their agenda way too clearly, but the internet never forgets. So what has Casey Luskin been doing since that first video? Has he cleaned up his act and started doing real science? Of course not, it's more of the same shit from him and all of his cronies every single day, lying about science for Jesus. But once in a while, morons like Casey slip up so bad that it opens up an opportunity to demonstrate their fraudulence with a level of clarity that even the most science-illiterate members of the public can grasp. And one such instance of this embarrassing behavior is what we will be going over today. Casey has been fixating on two topics as of late: junk DNA and universal common ancestry. Since he has a geology background, he manufactures a shred of credibility by accepting an old Earth, even though he doesn't fixate on it so as not to alienate all of their young Earth creationist supporters. But common ancestry is where he draws the line. Humans were made super special by God, obviously, which puts the entire field of biological anthropology in the crosshairs. Let's talk about junk DNA first. In May of last year, Casey had a debate with Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, a real biologist. The long and short of it is that Casey spent most of the debate repeating the usual Discovery Institute talking points about how finding function in some types of DNA like retrotransposons means we should think that most, if not all, of the genome is functional. This is their only tactic. We know that 1 to 2% is protein coding, we've learned over the decades that around 10% has regulatory function, and they twist that into, see, science is so arrogant. DNA has all these other functions, so there is no junk DNA. Yet they have zero basis for acting as though the other 90% has any function. This is a sticking point for them because large genomes with only a small fraction of functionality make perfect sense in the context of blind evolutionary processes, but very little sense in the context of special divine creation. So they just pretend all of it is functional without having any ability whatsoever to determine specific sequences or functions that support this baseless claim. Here's a taste of that.
What specific
Hold on,
functions? Wait, hang on. No, let me just finish the question. What specific functions could these sequences be doing that do not require sequence specificity?
I'm going to get to that in a minute. I want to talk about this idea that you just said, and excuse me, I'm losing my voice here, and I'm almost down to the bottom of my Starbucks cup.
Again, 90% of the genome has no known function. If you're going to claim that virtually all of the genome is functional, you should probably be able to describe what those functions are. But it was right at the end of the debate that he really blew it by acknowledging that we don't have a documented function for the majority of the genome.
And I have not seen any good evidence tonight from Dr. Dan that any particular genetic element that he cited cannot have evidence of function. So, but instead I've seen that the literature is replete with function. And the trend line of the research shows that we should anticipate more and more function is going to be found. And I think that these percentages of functional elements in the genome are going to go up, up, up. And we're just getting started. I mean, it could be another 100 years before we cross that 50% threshold, but I predict we're going to get there and we're going to go above that.
Yes, it's a function of the gaps argument. First, he flat out admits that most of the genome has no known function, but looking at the trend line, being the super clever scientist that he is, Casey extrapolates linearity like a middle schooler learning about graphs for the first time, and assumes that this means we will someday know the function of every last base pair. Dan can't prove that all these sequences have no function, so they probably do have functions, we just don't know what they are. This is like Graham Hancock whining about how his super awesome Atlantis civilization should be taken seriously until every single rock in the Sahara is overturned. Anyway, this exchange really exposes the fragility of Casey's pathetic script. His admission that most of the genome has no known function flies in the face of over a decade of DI propaganda. Pronouncements like the myth of junk DNA. They spent months doing damage control about this exchange, just like they did for my debate with James Tour, and every video I've done on them so far. Casey was even further exposed as a fraud. In such circumstances, they simply retreat to their pathetic propaganda blog, Evolution News, where they can lie freely with no pushback since there's no one there talking back and there's no way to leave comments. Here's one of Casey's tantrums called Creation Myths, Misquotes, and Misrepresents Junk DNA video. Be cautious when dealing with Dr. Dan. He's a real biologist who actually knows what he's talking about and very effectively exposes our lies. So it's best to avoid watching any of his content because he's a stupid buttface. Anyway, in this piece, he presented the following block quote. One big continuous block of text, yeah? Well, it turns out that was a Franken quote that he assembled from 3 separate paragraphs in a 2014 paper. There's a line from the abstract and 2 from completely separate sections within the paper itself, all presented as though it was a single passage. Pretty shady, no? When he got caught, he corrected the original by inserting ellipses, and he added this note to the bottom of the article. This post has been updated to fix a quote that was missing an ellipsis. Well, no, Casey, the original block quote wasn't missing an ellipsis. Ellipses are what you use when you want to condense one long quote by omitting certain portions that are irrelevant to what is being highlighted. Ellipses are not what you use when you want to cobble together a deceptive block of text by grabbing random sentences from different sections of a paper in order to remove context and twist their meaning. But way to be just as dishonest with your excuses for lying as with the lying itself. Later in this same series of articles, he got caught again, this time dishonestly conflating non-protein coding DNA with junk DNA. One of the most common functions of non-coding junk DNA is to regulate gene expression. When a given non-coding junk element is working properly, it regulates the gene it's supposed to be regulating. It does its job, and nobody notices it. And the BBC article further suggests that another gene desert, i.e. non-coding or junk DNA region, might have connections to various forms of cancer. Hey dumbass, regulatory regions are not referred to as junk DNA. Junk DNA is that with no function. So when you're describing a known function and pretending anyone refers to it as junk DNA, that's just you being a lying fraud. It's never, I repeat, never been the case that biologists thought all non-protein coding DNA was junk, since a number of functional non-protein coding sequences, like tRNA genes, promoters, and telomeres, were discovered years before anyone was using the term junk DNA in the scientific literature. Casey knows this. It was specifically brought to his attention in an email, but he just keeps spewing this shit. What the scientific community thought about junk DNA 50 years ago has no bearing on how much of the human genome is or isn't junk. But this is all they have. So Casey's foray into the junk DNA debate last year resulted in him being caught lying about the history of junk DNA, manipulating a quote to make it look like a paper said something it didn't, and best of all, undermining over a decade of DI talking points by accidentally telling the truth during a debate. But if getting bodied this badly wasn't enough, Casey decided to lie a whole lot about a new paper on hominid genetics. Can't teach an old dog new tricks, huh? In early April of this year, Yu et al. Released Complete Sequencing of Ape Genomes, a monumental paper including the sequencing and analyses of multiple species of ape that previously only had draft genomes. This included the chimpanzee, bonobo, gorilla, Bornean orangutan, Sumatran orangutan, and the siamang. The complete human genome, telomere to telomere, had been published in 2022, so this paper allowed complete comparison of all these apes to one another. This paper was groundbreaking in its contributions to comparative genomics, and revealed much about the other apes that we didn't previously appreciate due to the incomplete nature of their genomes. For example, bonobos and chimpanzees differ far more than previously appreciated in their centromeres, with 19 out of 48 bonobo centromeres experiencing a 300-fold reduction in size compared to chimps, despite diverging within the last 1.5 to 2 million years. But as fascinating as that is, we aren't concerned with these wonderful scientific findings. We are concerned with how Casey Luskin lied about them to push the narrative that humans and chimps are really way less similar than we previously thought. Because we can't possibly have common ancestry, right? They're stupid animals, and we are special god people. All those thousands of specimens of ancestral hominin species leading back to the common ancestor of humans and our closest relatives are actually either just humans or some kind of chimp, even though that's physically impossible, and precisely zero anthropologists subscribe to that. But we don't have to talk about fossils today, because the proof is in the DNA. About a month and a half after the paper was published, Luskin posted a series of garbage blog posts, including this one. Bombshell. New research overturns claim that humans and chimps differ by only 1% of DNA. Look at that angry ape bashing the stupid atheist materialist science molecule. Oh, and that dumb 1% lie is like the scientism monolith in the back, deceptively powering all of the atheist lies. When you dickbags bring Kubrick into this, you've gone too far. You will not sully my favorite movie of all time. Anyway, from the perspective of the poor saps reading this blog post thinking it's a credible source of information, this all sounds pretty groundbreaking. Is that what this new paper really says? If so, why haven't we heard the authors or any news outlets discussing these landmark findings? When I Google the paper title to get coverage for laypeople, I don't see anything like that. What's wrong with these jerks? We were wrong about how genetically similar humans and chimpanzees are all these years. This should be front page news. I mean, unless that's not the story, since the paper doesn't say that at all, and Casey is just being a lying sack of shit like always. In case you weren't aware, we have known for decades that humans and chimpanzees are one another's closest living relatives. You heard that right. It isn't just that the closest relative to humans is chimpanzees. The closest relative to chimpanzees is humans. Chimps, including their smaller variety, the bonobos, are more genetically similar to humans than they are to gorillas. We know this because we can sequence the genomes of all these apes, as this newest paper did, and compare them. Humans, together with panins, or chimps and bonobos, form a sister group with gorillas as the outgroup to them. Then the three of them form a triad with orangutans as the outgroup. And finally, all the hominids, or great apes, form a clade to the exclusion of the siamang. This is a phylogeny, or family tree, at the species level. It works just like family trees do within species. You can take a human pedigree, or family history, sequence everyone's genome, and their full genomic similarity will reflect their known family tree. This is basic genetic stuff, but we always have to review the basics when exposing creationists. This new paper certainly did nothing to overturn this knowledge. In fact, this phylogeny I've been displaying is from that paper. This means that the complete genomes produce the same family tree we've had for years. Likewise, for years we have known that humans and chimpanzees are over 99% similar when looking at their protein coding regions. We are also almost 99% similar looking at the entire genome while only taking into account single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, meaning only looking at variation at individual positions in the genome. We are about 96% similar when taking both SNPs and large-scale insertions and deletions, or indels, into account, and we are somewhere between 85 and 90% similar even when looking at raw alignment. These numbers have changed a bit here and there, but never substantially. You can see that raw alignment is much lower than the other measures of comparison. This is because all differences are treated as differences in this kind of comparison. Here's an analogy. Let's say we have two copies of a 10-page pamphlet, but the second copy of the pamphlet underwent a printer error, giving it 5 extra copies of page 3. An alignment of these books would say that version 2, with its 5 pages not present in version 1, is only 67% similar to version 1, even though they have all the same pages. This is because each duplication is counted as a difference, even if it's a duplication of a page they have in common. Likewise, if page 4 were accidentally printed backwards or upside down, that section would be considered 0% similar to its counterpart. Anyone can see that if we ignore a duplicated or inverted portion resulting from a singular copying error, they are identical. This is an important analogy because these are errors with direct parallels in biology. Large segments of the genome can be duplicated or inverted. This is a singular macromutation that can occur from one organism to the next, not two very long, totally unrelated sequences, which would require many separate mutation events. This must be taken into account. Geneticists have always understood that duplications or inversions can confound comparisons, so they typically report a % similarity between two organisms after the alignment has been made. Here is a 2014 paper on comparative primate genomics, which underscores how geneticists know the difference between alignment and sequence identity. This ambiguity is not new, at least not to real scientists, in contrast with Discovery Institute buffoons. In the case of humans and chimps, the relationship that triggers the liars for Jesus, we are looking at 99% similarity for the roughly 85% that can be aligned. There is precedent for this. When the genomes of several big cats were first sequenced, the common house cat was reported as 95% similar to a tiger. But the paper itself clarifies that this is for the roughly 84% of the genomes that could be compared. Notice that this did not impact the phylogeny one bit. This is common practice in genetics because the regions of difference due to large-scale insertions, deletions, inversions, and duplications are typically in non-functional regions of the genome. Yes, Casey, I said non-functional. This allows them to accumulate quickly even within a single species since they are not deleterious. How does any of this information affect the results of this new paper? It doesn't. There is nothing about this new paper that changes the fundamental evolutionary relationship between humans and chimpanzees, nor does it impact general estimates for the % similarity by various methods of comparison. The big news of the paper, as previously mentioned, came from insight into all species examined, but primarily those which now have more complete genomes. And yet, this bombshell blog post is one of over a dozen by Luskin attempting to argue that this new paper overturns the myth of 1%. Yes, Luskin is pretending that this new paper has presented work that overturns the 99% similarity between human and chimps for protein coding regions or whole genome with SNPs, with a whopping 14% reduction from that figure, according to the title of the next blog post. Fact check. New complete chimp genome shows 14.9% difference from the human genome. Remember, the paper does not do this at all. It does not seriously revise the known figures for genetic similarity or any aspect of the evolutionary relationships in this clade. So to sell the idea that it does, Casey has to lie a lot. How does he do it? Casey points to a line in the main text, a figure from the supplementary material, and a table from the supplementary material. In doing so, he reveals his ignorance on the history of genomic comparisons and genetics in general, as well as his willingness to lie for Jesus. Let's talk about the ignorance first. First, Casey thinks that this paper is groundbreaking for the human-chimp relationship because the chimp genome is finally complete, was assembled using non-humanized data, and thus reported a brand new number that is strikingly different from the one we typically see. Quoting from the first post, "As I will elaborate in a subsequent article, this team of researchers has published complete sequences of ape genomes that were created from scratch rather than using the human genome as a template. As a result, for the first time, we can attempt a much more accurate assessment of the true degree of difference between the human and chimp genomes." Casey says this because he does not know that alignment numbers and aligned sequence identity, or % similarity in protein coding, whole genome SNPs, and whole genome SNPs plus indels have been reported for over a decade. Here's one from Marsaei et al. From 2018 that reports a 9.9% difference in alignment of human to chimp and a 4.3 difference in alignment of chimp to human. It also reported a 98.8% similarity between the aligned regions of humans and chimps, just as we've always seen. Casey also doesn't know that we've been using non-humanized ape genomes since 2018, and that the chimpanzee genome was, apart from some very difficult to sequence regions, largely complete by then. Casey seems to think that the paper's alignment numbers, themselves not new estimates, are meant to replace the old sequence identity numbers. This is an apples to oranges comparison. They're two different numbers derived from two different methods. One did not replace the other. They have both existed since the start of major human-chimp comparisons, and they measure different things. But Casey wants to pretend the new paper is the first to use nearly complete genomes that were not erroneously humanized, and that it was the first to report that humans and chimps are only 85% similar. It isn't, and it doesn't. Casey just doesn't know the difference between alignment and sequence identity. The authors do, and they know the history of alignments versus other types of comparison, like protein coding, whole genome SNPs only, and whole genome SNPs plus indels. That's why this wasn't reported as news in the abstract, anywhere in the paper or supplementary material, or in any articles about the study, because it wasn't news. These are not new numbers. Casey Casey is pretending the paper is reporting new paradigm-overturning numbers, so he's either a complete moron with zero knowledge of the literature in this area, or he's a lying fraud, or both. Ever aware of their uphill battle against mountains of real science, here comes the conspiracy. Casey proposes that someone, one of the authors of the paper or the authors of the Nature summary articles, intentionally buried or even hid the alignment numbers to protect the myth of 1%. Despite the numbers being reported broadly in the main text, Casey pretends they have been unceremoniously dumped in the supplementary material by nefarious evolutionists. He says, look back at those numbers, 12.5 to 27.3%. The same numbers show up again buried deep in the supplemental data where they compare various ape to human genomes. They're findable if you know where to look, but should I say buried or hidden? No, Casey, you shouldn't say that since that's a lie. The numbers are in the main text and it's not new information. You just need some drama to sell your lies to the brainwashed idiots who don't know you're not a reliable source of information. Now for the real fireworks. To highlight the allegedly new human-chimp difference, Casey points to a figure from the supplementary material, figure 3.12. This figure shows the gap divergence of humans versus several other apes, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and one species of orangutan. The gap divergence is similar to the alignment number, but it does not include the SNP difference. Casey is elated, especially when he adds the small SNP differences onto the gap divergence numbers for a grand total alignment difference. He says, so now what we're seeing is that there is about a 14.9% total difference between the human genome and the chimp genome. That represents a much greater degree of difference than the often claimed statistic that we are only 1% genetically different from chimpanzees. Let's take a look at that figure again. Casey is getting his gap divergence numbers by subtracting each value from 1 and presenting that as a percentage. For example, PanTro3, the chimp, to HG002, the human, has 0.124732 for the gap divergence. This is a 12.5% difference, equating to 87.5 similarity. He then takes the SNP sequence identity difference from the preceding figure, supplementary figure 3.11, and adds that to the gap divergence difference for grand totals. Wow, look at how different everything is from humans. Except we know that these low alignment numbers for humans and chimps aren't new or groundbreaking, they're simply another means to compare genomes, like the pamphlets with the missing or inverted pages. In fact, we can go to the supplementary GitHub and calculate some additional gap divergences and alignments for ourselves to show us just how harmful these numbers actually are to creationists who want to use them to claim that humans are a fundamentally different creation from other apes. Running those numbers, we see that the gap divergence for chimpanzees and bonobos, which all creationists accept as related, is 88.3 to 90.1%. That sure makes the human-chimp gap divergence of 86.7 to 87.5% seem pretty unremarkable, huh? Or how about the two orangutan species, 91.1 to 91.5%? That's weird, because by the same method used to show that humans and chimps are 98.8% similar, chimps and bonobos are over 99% similar. So are the orangutans. And yet, both drop proportionally when using gap divergence. It's almost like geneticists knew this already and aren't surprised by it one bit. You can see the full alignment numbers reveal a similar trend. But it gets even better than Casey being a clueless asshat who didn't know that these alignment numbers have been estimated for years and do not help creationists one bit. Do you notice anything odd about his replication of that figure? Maybe a little purple smudge at the bottom left? Uh-oh, it looks like Casey edited the figure, cutting out the gap divergence for within orangutans, gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and humans. And yes, he didn't just crop a section off, he specifically edited the figure to remove inconvenient data but retain the axis, so that the axis label and values can still be seen. What does this deliberately removed data say? Something damning to his point, perhaps? Of course. These omitted data reveal that the within gorilla gap divergence is 13.8%, higher than the highest estimate for humans and chimps of 13.3%. This means that gorilla populations have changed more within themselves than humans have compared to chimps, at least looking at these large-scale structural variations, including duplications, inversions, deletions, and insertions. This unthinkable genetic dissimilarity that Casey wants his viewers to marvel at, the dissimilarity that proves we can't possibly have evolved from a common ancestor, is less than the dissimilarity for gorillas compared with themselves. Do you see now why this jerk-off felt the need to snip it out? It's Michael Behe and the polar bear table all over again. This is all these morons can do. Point at primary scientific literature to pretend that they're on the cutting edge, and then do everything they can to butcher it and mislead the reader into thinking it says something that supports their baseless ideology. That's not even the only time Casey lies. In a later blog post, he references another method of alignment in the paper that utilizes a program called Progressive Cactus. He specifically cites the human-chimp alignment from Supplementary Table 319, boasting that the researchers found humans and chimps are only 84.95% similar by this method. Put aside the fact that alignment number estimates are not new, and that by this method we already showed that chimps and bonobos similarly drop to 88 to 90% similar, and two types of orangutans to 90% similar. He pulls the number from this spot on the table, 84.95 in identical 1-to-1 for human and chimp autosomes. You can see that below, the complete human genome is also compared to bonobos, gorillas, etc. But what's that line above the chimp comparison? GRCH38? Oh, would you look at that? It's a human genome. So by the exact same method that Casey is using to conclude that humans and chimps are just a lousy 85% similar, humans and other humans are only 87% similar. Astounding, isn't it? Hey Casey, which crappy races are you suggesting can't have common ancestry with the good ones? Is this your way of sliding into eugenics territory? For people who actually give a shit about reality, these results are similar to what we saw for the within-species variation of gorillas, and additional papers support the notion that any species, humans included, can rapidly accumulate differences in the non-functional portions of the genome. This is because while SNPs impact only one base pair at a time, large-scale insertions, deletions, duplications, and inversions can impact hundreds or even thousands of base pairs with just one macromutation, quickly leading to what Casey would consider big differences even from one generation to the next. These differences are non-functional, meaning that race realists can't use this method to suggest that some humans are a different, better or worse species or some other such garbage. But it also means that Casey shouldn't be using it to compare humans and chimps. So is he dishonest or stupid? Casey is obviously aware that this method maximizes differences between all organisms, even members of the same species, but showing that to his audience will dampen the impact. How persuasive is 85% similarity between humans and chimps if humans and some other humans are only 87% similar? Do you know how similar rats and mice are by this method? 70%. But those are definitely still related, right, Casey? Quick, edit the data to make it suit your narrative. The bottom line is this: we can compare genomes in different ways, but some of them are more meaningful than others. For this reason, while the genetics community has been reporting all of these comparisons, they tend to emphasize the functional or easily alignable regions of the genome. Remember the pamphlets? Duplicate a page a few times. Are they now suddenly totally different? No, they're identical apart from a singular error, and we can have different metrics that report resulting similarities and differences in different ways. Scientists know what these different metrics are and how they can be useful. Lying creationist stooges like Casey know exactly what they're doing. It's all been pointed out right to their face numerous times. Do they change their tune? Of course not. All Casey did was add this pathetic little author's note because he got caught red-handed. I only edited the table to omit the data that refutes me because it wasn't relevant to my argument. That's right, if I posted the whole table, that would be so super confusing to people, even though they have no clue what any of it means. I had to chop out this data and reaffix the x-axis as though they were never there, because there's no other way to do it. The bottom 5 curves that specifically expose me as a deceptive fraud are irrelevant, I swear. Don't look at them or ask me what they mean. What an asshole. A dozen blog posts like this, not a word is altered, no matter how badly his deception is exposed. And guess what? Since all the other internet creationists are even dumber than him, they've all regurgitated this bullshit like it's gospel. While they're all science-illiterate sheep unknowingly regurgitating lies, these jerks at the DI deserve no pity whatsoever. They know exactly what they're doing, and we all know why. Luskin and the rest of the DI want to sell the idea that humans are special creations of the Christian God, that common ancestry isn't true, and that science specifically reveals this amazing fact. All of the nasty atheist science with the agenda to destroy the long debunked regressive worldview of the fundamentalist Christian, it actually supports your delusions. You just have to know how to read it. That's what the DI is for, to convince fundamentalist Christians who are hostile towards science that disproves their faith that science actually confirms it, as long as you don't know any science and only look at their distorted explanations and deceptively edited data tables. But reality sings a very different tune. Humans are apes that evolved from other ancestral apes. While this remains an outrageous notion to those who can't handle reality, it's not even remotely controversial within the scientific community, and not a single working biological anthropologist denies this fact. This new paper Casey makes a fuss about only further confirms previous work in comparative genomics and traditional phylogeny. His lies have been exposed. Perhaps they felt emboldened to lie some more since I haven't covered them in a while. Well, surprise, cockbags, I'm back to pin you against the wall some more. Who are you going to get to do the damage control this time? Gunter Beckley is dead. He murdered some people by crashing his car into them while killing himself. Got anyone else in mind? Aaron boy Jonathan McLatchie? Nah, nobody takes that dork seriously. McDarmid? Klinghoffer? Throw your pawns at me and see what happens. I'll just be here working my way down the list. So that's it for Casey Luskin. Again, I can't believe I let these jerks off the hook for over a year. Too many other frauds to expose, I guess. But now I'm back with a vengeance. Who's gonna get the heat next? Got any ideas? Until next time.